Hey everybody, today we are talking about conversational AI in games. Now, with us today to discuss is Kylan Gibbs, is Chief Product Officer at Inworld AI, the company currently with the biggest buzz and funding in this space. They have raised a lot of money, including a reported $50 million Series A last year, although rumored that it was actually even a lot more than 50 million, and at an over $500 million valuation. They also just recently announced a partnership with Xbox to include Inworld's NPC AI technology in games developed by Xbox. Also with us is Travis Boatman, a super experienced mobile game executive and CEO of Carbonated. He's one of the most sophisticated CEOs for AI in games in the industry, and he's actively integrating AI into his new mobile game. So let's find out what this is all about. Let's dive in deep. We're coming at you right now. Today's episode is sponsored by Data.ai to access estimates for rankings, downloads, revenue, usage, or engagement for millions of apps on the App Store and Google Play. Sign up for Data.ai. Colin, I thought we could start with a question about you because there is so much excitement and hype, and certainly there's a lot of people recording podcasts about AI and gaming, and there seems to be like a lot of like high level, in terms of the general direction things are going and things like that. But I do feel like a big part of the in-role thesis is directed at gaming and specifically AI NPCs for gaming. So I thought just wanted to first start off by asking you about, from your perspective, what are the major application areas for AI in games that you see? And then why did you guys at Enrolled specifically decide to focus on the AI NPCs and sort of the conversational AI application area as opposed to some of the other areas?
Awesome. Yeah, so I'll take that backwards. So I'll kind of start with a bit of the origin story, and then I think I can get like go through the learnings that we've had of like where I think this lands in games today and into the future. So my own background, I've been generative AI for a while now, like most of my career, kind of before it was cool, and sort of was at Google and at DeepMind actually helping to sort of build a lot of the models and then productionize those. I'm just working with Google teams sort of across like search and assistant and cloud. And my job was basically taking a lot of the large language models and figuring out where it fit into Google products. And during that period, there was a lot of learnings of the types of products, the types of use cases where it resonated the most, and also where there were the most challenges. And I met our CTO and my other co-founder, Mike, who was working at Google Cloud Conversational AI, and he had previously founded a company with Ilya, our other co-founder, who had actually built a company called API.ai, which got acquired by Google and became Google Dialogflow. And so you can kind of think about there as like our backgrounds were, and Dialogflow is the conversational AI platform that kind of powers most assistant type platforms today, including Google Assistant. And so we are coming from this with a background in generative AI and developer platforms, and we were really looking at the ecosystem and just we're all gamers and in our personal life, and one of the big things that we were recognizing is, okay, people are spending a significant amount of their life in virtual worlds, right? And the difference, like, you think about a game from a Mario to an Elden Ring, the level of immersion is significantly different. Even the time spent in there is significantly different. And then you, of course, go into your competitive games, and every people are spending hundreds of hours, a month in these games. And the big thing that was missing compared to our normal lives is the kind of actual humanity, like the people, the interactions, the characters. And what's interesting is like we've got very used to game mechanics as they've existed over the last 30 years. We've seen some changes in game mechanics, basic game designs, but it's really been graphics that have evolved mainly over time. And what we saw is, okay, if people are spending most of their time in these worlds, and if you compare them to our real world, where most of the mechanics, the way that we solve problems, like do puzzles, collaborate, it's all via human or at least semi-human interaction. And so we were like, that's a big missing component. And even if you think about game mechanics, it's like, why do game mechanics really not involve that same type of problem solving that we use in our regular life? Well, and the fundamental answer is like, there's just not the technology for it. Like, you can't create NPCs are basically these like blunt objects that you can create dialogue trees around and can kind of facilitate storytelling, but ultimately don't, contribute to the immersion a lot. And so we basically set out to create a platform that actually solved that problem and created, ultimately the developer platform to populate these virtual worlds with AI characters. And when we first started out, there was the meta announcement and the metaverse hype and all these kinds of things. So, we were swimming through all of these, these nudges from different customers and asks. And, we initially, of course, also, naively, I guess, weren't being super creative. We thought, oh, you take Assassin's Creed, you take Elden Ring, you take Skyrim, and you make the characters talk. And this kind of comes to the question that you asked first, which is like, where are you seeing this in actual game designs today? And I think what's been really interesting for me over the last year, especially as game studios have started adopting this, is it's not at all about taking existing game designs and making characters talk. It's actually about introducing completely new game mechanics. Like one of the best quotes that I've got from customers, like, we don't want to take Legend of Zelda and make Navi talk. We want to take Legend of Zelda and make the characters into the water temple. Meaning, like, you can imagine you have, your quest is to make these two characters, let's say it's a princess and you need her to, marry the king. But in order to do that, you've got to find who are their five most influenced, who are the people that most influence them, and what are the missions and the conversations that you need to have with each of those people to convince that person to, like the other person. And maybe you need to figure out, okay, one of these people is actually a snitch, one of these people actually speaks badly about everyone, that you talk to them about, and there's these really unique character. One example was this customer had a group of four characters in a single scenario that resulted in an hour and a half of gameplay, like compelling gameplay through playtest and everything. And it completely changes the game mechanics. And so what I've seen is there's like three main things that characters contribute to for core game loops. The first is like deepening relationships. So maybe folks have played Baldur's Gate. The relationships you're able to develop with the characters there are deep. And the amount of, I don't know if you've seen the visualizations of the dialogue trees that they had to build, but it's like hilarious. But the ability to actually build those relationships deepens the complexity, the meaning of the game immensely. And that's just using sort of scripted dialogue still, and still sometimes I feel like I'm clicking through every step. But the concept of relationship I want to expand, not just to like not just romantic relationships or anything like this, but actually how do you relate to the other people in the game that you're playing with, who similarly to if you were playing a PvP game, you might have that relationship with someone that you're playing against or with. And then so that's relationships is I think where it introduces that kind of level of complexity, and that can also change the actually be a core part of the game mechanic. The second, yeah, so yeah, I guess like wrapping up on relationships, like the way that I see that is like actually just changing the way that the actual like emotional investment that the player basically has um, within the game. So the second part is like progression. So this is kind of the idea that characters can give you new signals of progression. So in games, usually, the core thing is that you have to give the player this constant sense of moving forward. Whether that's by them picking up new items, unlocking some, experience points, them getting something. There's this constant sense of progression, and characters can actually give you that sense of progression as well by giving you some signals or feedback as you're going through the game. So, for example, NetEase recently launched a game, Cygnus Enterprises, where like this character is kind of like a Navi style character is actually giving you feedback consistently, and so you're kind of constantly getting this like level of feedback depending on your performance in the game, and that gives you this sense of like I'm doing something and someone cares about that. And that means like progression, as however you want to design it, is something that can really be built I guess into the core game mechanics. So I guess I've been talking. I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on those before I go on.
For the audience side of things, we actually have, Kyle and I kind of know each other through the industry, but we've never actually gone like on a deep dive with each other. So, I'm sort of in the audience's perspective. This like I want to learn more, and I think one of the ways that I want to learn more, both selfishly for my team one day, when we go talking about ways we can work together, but also I guess for the audience as well. Like how are people that you're partnering with right now? Like what are they excited about? How are they starting to use your stuff? Like what sort of from the studios you're partnering? Yeah, what are they showing? Like, oh, we're going to use it like this, or we did this cool thing with it. Like, tell us a little about what your customers are using it and where they're sort of excited about it.
For sure. Yeah. So then I guess that brings me to like the third point. And I'll wrap up and then I'll give you an example. So the last point is sort of progression relationships, and then role playing is the biggest one I think, which is the actual ability for you to enact a role and feel like you're being put in that role. And I think role playing I want to extend. Like we have a character who's, for example, like a therapist character, and the goal of the character is to basically make the person feel like they're actually in a therapy session, right? And they can contribute to that through a lot of different inputs and gestures and actions. And so the character's job is basically to facilitate that. And so when you combine those three things around like relationships, role playing, and progression, a really common use case we're seeing from AAA partners is something I would call like social simulator scenarios. So kind of like what I was bringing up before of like, the water temple, but you basically have, um, yeah. So yeah, without I don't want to mention any names, unfortunately, but there's some very popular games that are centered around. You can think about like high school,
You're
college,
like, it's
students.
like this, but no, it's
Yeah. And so you can imagine a scenario where you have some superpowers or you have some capacities, and you go into a world and your job is to basically solve some crime or solve some situation. And so there's maybe five main characters, 10 side characters, and then there's a whole world of living characters around that. And you want to have the player sort of step into that world, and then be, instead of having a tutorial or anything, character greets them and says, hey Joe, I need you to come and do this with me and whatever, right? And then you probably go off piece and you ask them a bunch of stupid questions, but then the character kind of brings you back. And then let's say he walks up to another group of characters, initiates a conversation with them. You listen to that conversation, and that gives you the context on the world and the scenario, versus you having, for example, to read some card, or get some overview. And then you're prompted and you're said, hey, we noticed that, like, Jimmy is, he's actually been really upset lately, but he's a really core part of the group, and we can't actually, progress forward with this mission until we get him involved. And so you've got to then ask, where's Jimmy's house? And you go over to Jimmy's house and you actually have a conversation with him to convince him that actually you're really important to this group, and you have to build your trust level with him. So literally, there's like a trust score that goes up that then activates a trigger on the game engine side, which, like, Jimmy gets out of bed and decides to come with you. And so all of this is basically just done through conversation, but it completely changes that game mechanic. And then what's interesting is all the characters share information. And so what that means is, as things are said, you kind of have this like emergent storytelling piece as well, where you're still being beholden to that core game design, and we have things like fourth wall controls that make sure that there's no hallucination. But as soon as something is said, so let's say I said, I'm actually a detective in my previous life, and I'm now just here helping you all out. Now all the other characters will know that I'm a detective, and they'll respond to me accordingly. If they answer any questions, like, for example, let's say in the character, Jimmy mentioned something that actually was never in the script. All the other characters have access to the information, so that it maintains that coherence. Because I even find, like, and if you take any actions, for example, like, let's say I hit Jimmy's dog, and Jimmy was mad about that. Now all the other characters are going to say, like, stay away from my dog, Travis. I really think that's a dangerous scenario, which means you have this kind of context of like this. And I think this is why I always push, like, AI NPCs are kind of like the symptom, but what is actually happening in the background of that is like a living world. And every action that you take has a consequence that is actually saved down to that entire session state, so that whenever you interact with anyone else, that consequence is felt. Similar to, like, I think games like Baldur's Gate do this really well, but in a sort of more limited capacity. And so at the end of the day, the entire, you might go through a 5-hour mission just by going between characters and having conversations and changing people's trust scores, and maybe, having to take some actions that, change their status. And all of that is basically just, controlled by this system. And, the talking character part of it is like the endpoint, but is ultimately the sort of the mass of the entire, like, living world that we're basically orchestrating in the back end, is, I think, what actually is like the big change there.
Travis, do you like, based upon what you're hearing, and I think just for the audience, in my experience, just talking to you, Travis, about AI and gaming, you seem to be kind of on the forefront in terms of like how you're trying to integrate AI in your game. And I don't know how much you can talk about that yet, but how, like, what are you specifically looking for in terms of some of these capabilities? And I can go ahead and speak to kind of like what I'm looking at as well.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to dive into it. So I think for me, again, I'm an old timer. I've been doing games since like the late '80s, so I'm a super old timer. And I think one of the things that I've learned over the years to still hopefully stay relevant in the games industry is you sort of have to keep learning all the new tech. Otherwise, I could say, like, I was really good at the Sega Genesis, right? And like, where did that go? So you're always kind of on the front end of learning. And so, you know, I, I think there's been lots of great changes to the games industry over the years. And I think that the two big ones that come to my mind was obviously, the internet hit like all parts of the game industry. And I have sort of like three parts that I talk about. It's like tech, it's business, and it's the creative parts of the business. And the internet, sort of the rival of the internet, hit all three of those. Other things hit one segment of it. Graphics hit the visual creative side, and in-app purchase sort of hits a little bit of both, whatever. But the AI stuff is the second time I've ever seen anything that hits like all of them at the same time. Like it hits the technical side, allows you new ways of engineers to code, right? Whether it's Copilot or it's ChatGPT or whatever. So the technical implications of AI on game production, strictly on the technical side, is amazing. All of our engineers are using some version of this or another. We have a UI guy in our team who's not hard a coder, but he's coding all of his own UI stuff using ChatGPT and Copilot. So the technical implications of it are pretty amazing. The business implications of it are pretty amazing. We have in our game that isn't quite announced yet, we're doing a lot of kind of like live ops globalization stuff. And we had a huge pipeline that we were building for like taking our content everywhere in the world. And they had, we'll just say millions of dollars of expected cost coming to us. But now with the large language models, you can generate all of that content, globally and translate it at the same time and integrate it into your backend through the technical APIs to allow you to create content, deploy it in a way that is a massive cost savings that we were about to hit. And then, of course, on the creative side, I think which what most people see on the internet, but on the creative side, it's the mid journeys, it's the image creation. I love 11 Labs. I'm like a hardcore user of 11 Labs. I've got multiple voice models trained, mine, my dad, my family, our in-game stuff. Like we're using it all over the place. And it's amazing to see it hit all three. And so to stay relevant, back to kind of, career longevity, for those of you guys in the audience who want to be in games, keep learning, because if you learn something too well and it goes away, you're going to have to evolve. And so when this AI stuff showed up, I sort of, this is one of those learning moments. I better start learning. And so I've been spending a lot of time just playing and experimenting. Joe and I spend a lot of time talking to each other. That's how he heard about some of my experimentations. One of our friends, Kenshi, he's super in the learning mode too. And he and I kind of share ideas back and forth. But given that I'm sort of learning on my own and experimenting, I have like the personal lens of what I think matters to both myself and to customers. But because we're also running a studio, you can see the direct correlation of like, oh, this isn't just technically cool. It actually has direct implications to player experience and to costs and to the ability to make cooler content globally, all this cool stuff. And so, where it makes sense for us, we found like 4 different places where it directly just makes sense. And in a way that it was things we were already doing. So I think the way that we plugged it, it wasn't like we were like, oh, there's AI, let's chase AI and be part of the buzzword thing. It was more that we already had this feature planned and it was going to be expensive and narrow. And then when the AI stuff showed up, we could be like, well, now this narrow feature is going to have way more color, way more sophistication. And it's going to be broad because we can bring this feature to everybody on Earth at the same time. I would also say you can make it super personalized. I'll tell one other story about playing with AI. I was playing with 11 Labs and I was going to a dinner, and I was sitting with a bunch of other folks from the games industry. And on my way to dinner, I went on my phone, I recorded some stuff on 11 Labs and this person's voice, who I happened to grab, and I had to customize some specific stuff about the guy at dinner. When I was sitting next to him at dinner, I said, hey, have you heard of this 11 Labs and ChatGPT stuff? And he had heard about it a little bit. And I said, check this out. And I had a DID character face, which was Midjourney generated. So I went to Midjourney, I made a character face. I had it talk, so it was animating, and it was using a voice that this guy was familiar with, and it was talking directly about him. And I had created all that while I was in an Uber on the way there, and it blew this guy's mind. And I was doing it because I was testing to see, like, do people care about this? Like, I think it's cool, but do players or does audience care about that? And his reaction, that was just like his mind was blown, and he was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever. How did you do that? And I was like, I just kind of played with these 4 different tools and kind of, really ugly way stitched them together. But the using AI to personalize content for customers is amazingly powerful, because when it says your name and it talks about you and things that are happening 10 minutes ago in your life, that directly translated to me in game making, which is like, oh, if you're a player in a game, it can use your character's name, it can talk about things you just did, and it can say it in your local language, which is crazy to me. That's just so awesome. And so after a couple of those experiments personally, we just had huge conviction. And so you might imagine we're building a whole bunch of different systems into our production that will hopefully make those experiences for players very unique and custom to them, which, you frankly just couldn't do before. Even at a big company, I was at EA and at Zynga and, been a bunch of big companies, and you have big dollars, you still couldn't do that at scale. Like, it's so difficult to build, as Conor was mentioning, like these conversation decision AI trees that have to like figure out and then try to build on and then localize it. And it's so cost prohibitive. Now it's almost straight out of the box. It's pretty wild. Anyway, a little bit of a ramble, but I'm super pro on all this stuff. I'm a big fan. I think it's awesome. It's going to make better experiences for customers. It's pretty neat.
And Kylan, maybe I could ask you, so like the specific application, and especially when it comes to the conversational AI part that I think about is, so we're going to start a new game project in the next month or two. And one of the game designs would involve a character. And kind of like the way that I'm viewing conversational AI is in kind of like two big buckets for us. One is like kind of like this nice to have, which is from the perspective that, if you have an interactable character, kind of what you described, the first point about creating a deeper interaction, better emotional connection with a character in the game that you're interfacing with, and having that character also understand the context of the game, where you could actually get tips from that character, where it's like, hey, we lost that last battle, you should actually get this card or upgrade this rune or something like that. And I just think that people are lonely. So like just, having somebody to talk to in a game, I think, I've worked in Forex before, and we saw like some of the retention and monetization numbers based upon if a player joined an alliance or not, but potentially having that move metrics, and also just the notion of a strange attractor, right? So having like this kind of like, to the point that Travis had, is like, oh, hey, this is kind of cool. I didn't know games like that could do that, or maybe this game could do these things. So that's one part. And then the second part that I'm thinking about, and this actually goes back to a podcast we recorded a while back, Travis, where you talked about how there are new opportunities in gaming based upon technology advancement, kind of like, when John Carmack came up with all the 3D stuff that enabled games like Doom and Quake and things like that. And so on the second part, I'm wondering also, Kylan, is around the new kinds of games that fundamentally integrate your technology in such a fundamental way to enable like a new genre of game or something like that. But I just wanted to kind of express how I'm thinking about conversational AI, and whether you would agree or disagree with like how I'm viewing the technology, and whether that fits and if that aligns with what you guys are doing at Inworld.
Yeah, so I mean, on your first point, I think that the most interesting thing I've observed is, we kind of had this hypothesis coming in when we built the company that, if we build this platform to allow people to interact with characters, like that's kind of enough. And I think that's kind of true. It's interesting. There's a novelty factor to that. We've also realized is like the relationships that you have with these characters. So like think about like, I love Final Fantasy VII. Like Cloud Strife was like, my like OG coolest person I could imagine. And to actually be able to develop a meaningful relationship with that person is kind of like, for the people who fanboy over Elon Musk, right? It's like having that personal relationship with Elon. But in the game context, like you're in their world. And so if you as the game designer do a good job as well in like character building and narrative design, your character is going to really pop out. And then I really do want to get deeper with that person. And so it allows me to get deeper into the world and explore the lore. So like there's a lot of times, right? Like, I've spent way too much time on Baldur's Gate over the last little while. And there's times when it's like I don't actually know what the heck Githyanki is. Like what is the background there? I'm like I haven't really been given the options in dialogue to be able to ask that question. I just want to go talk to a character and ask them all these questions, and I can't do that. And so it allows me to develop that individual relationship with the character, but also to develop that individual relationship with the world itself. And because I'm also playing a role within that world, I feel like I'm being seen within it. And like one of the things that I think we've seen over the last little while is, for better or for worse, it's really hard to build a new IP or a new world. And once you do, there's a million and one spin-offs off of that. And so I think the AI as well will help people develop that like deeper investment in the world as well as that character relationship. And so to your point on like, people developing that more meaningful emotional relationship with the character, I think it also deepens it with the world and also with the storyline itself and makes it feel like, I'm able to interact with the narrative how I want to as a person. And that kind of ties to like where we're seeing, I think, like there's definitely like the biggest thing advice that I loved one of my friends who's a notable writer suggested was, when you look at what's happening with AI right now, like Travis, you mentioned like the mid journey example, right? Like the first thing people do within technology is try and create what people have done before, right? But faster and easier. So it's like, artists can make a picture, but now I can generate a picture in like a few seconds. But he was like, focus on the new types of media that have never been possible before, because ultimately, one, that's where you're not going to be competing. You're going to be adding to creatives capacity versus maybe eroding their paychecks, and you're going to be contributing something new to the market and expanding that pie overall. And so that's kind of like where, like, in the kind of former camp of like new game, like add-ons to existing game designs, something that we've seen is common that actually wasn't expected is basically companion style characters for first person shooters or real-time strategies, where you basically have something like a Cortana style character who's coming along with you, responding to things in real time. You can often make commands through that character. So you can be like, okay, I go pick up the ore, and then like set off the alert and do this. So it's basically you have that kind of it's similar to like if you're playing with another player, so you're kind of adding to that. Similarly, within RPGs, of course, being able to just have those conversations. You can think about basically any like JRPG, being able to have those side of scripted dialogues, but turning that into something where I can ask any question that I want if I want to. That's a big one. And then there's, of course, I think there's any sort of big narrative game. You can think about the Bioshock style. I think just that ability to deepen the relationships with characters in the world is beneficial. Now, going on to new game designs, I think there's something around this, like, the more, I guess, less triple AE types of games, right? So, for example, in a lot of Asian countries right now, these kinds of social simulators have really popped up. So these, like, there's a huge genre of them basically on mobile apps, and the idea is you're kind of playing out some form of social scenario, whether that's at school or work or whatever it is, and you're just going through basically a bunch of dialogue trees. And so there's a huge opening up there to basically turn those into like proper types of like simulation games. So simulation, I think, is an interesting one. I think how that expands into things like you can think about The Sims, but in a more advanced way, where you're actually seeing characters interacting and you're more in like an observing mode, but maybe being able to influence that is something that we're seeing come up a lot. And basically, I think there's this genre of what I would call like interaction focused role playing games, right? Where instead of these turn based strategies or whatever you're doing, I don't know how much you both have played, like, but in Baldur's Gate, for example, right, you have your dialogue turns, and a lot of the gameplay and the actual like success comes through rolls of the die. You could imagine that, but you're sort of going through that in a sort of a conversational or interactive way. And so that's I think a big one is those role playing games. I think in the context of mobile games, being able to even inject frankly, a lot of people are even using it where they're just sending a trigger from the game engine side to our server that's causing the character to speak. And so that's just like removing the need to build out dialogue trees. You're just basically now have an infinite number of responses that the character could give. So that's in sort of mobile, basically anywhere from a first person shooter or these strategy types of games on mobile. And then a big one that is definitely coming up is like detective style games. This has probably been most of our launches. So games where you're uncovering some form of information to kind of progress the story. And that information may mean that you need to get one piece of sort of information from one person to give to another person to then unlock the next piece of information. And that sort of is definitely lends itself well to the technology of kind of just having that unlock. And like all those things that I mentioned, you can imagine how those can be combined in certain game designs. But definitely, I think like social simulation, detective style role playing games, as well as kind of like the one that we hadn't really expected is the companion mode or guide mode for different characters, basically across any game design, is super interesting. And then there's a few new things that we've seen also popping up, which we call like I call them like a show game hybrid, where you have something like a TV show, but someone's actually controlling it in real time. So you basically have the characters interacting, and then you have like a streamer who's actually controlling in the background what the characters are going to say next, and they can respond to the audience and they can actually enact that. And so those are like completely weird, creative mode that we've seen come up, and I think those we'll see the first test coming out of that in December. But those are all, I think, super exciting, and kind of what I've been most excited by is the fact that we're seeing completely new types of game designs being imagined and game mechanics being imagined, as well as augmenting, as Travis said, those existing game mechanics and just expanding the how narrow, I guess, a possible feature or a scenario could be.
In terms of like, I think the market's already spoken in terms of excitement about Inworld. In terms of I think it's been reported that you guys raised 50 million on a over $500 million valuation. So clearly, people are excited. Is that based largely on the opportunity just within gaming and existing kinds of applications, or does that contemplate like people figuring out new game styles, genres, and also expanding outside of gaming?
So we started out being a bit more agnostic beyond gaming, but I think now we've really settled down to like gaming as our core focus. And for example, when we even worked through the investment with Lightspeed, Moritz, who is the partner there, actually leads Lightspeed Gaming. He's, man, he was like, you both, I think, know Moritz, and
Yeah.
he's a huge gamer himself. And like the hypothesis is really focused on gaming, right? Like, sure, there's probably some value in a lot of other areas around like learning and education and enterprise, but ultimately the feature set is going to be very different, and how we build the platform is going to be very different versus working with game developers. And so that is our core focus, and I think most of this valuation and the excitement and everything is really focused on gaming. Whether or not it's sort of I think there is definitely a bet on new game designs coming out, right? Like, I think over the next 2 to 5 years, I think there will be a lot of sort of revamping existing types of game designs. But the hope is that, over the next 10 years, we see, half the market now stepping into this new core game loop that requires this type of interactive AI as a part of that. And we're also thoughtful of like, how do we make that the easiest to adopt? So we're looking at ways of dramatically reducing prices, looking at on-device serving, making it more efficient, because I think that ultimately, like, if most of the gaming market starts adopting this stuff and you have hundreds of millions of hours being logged every day, you're going to want to make sure that all of that stuff works well. And so I think there's definitely the bet on the kind of existing game designs, the new game designs, and also how we fit this into like being a core tool within the game development space overall.
With the current technology you have at Inworld, could you run like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign with the Inworld AI as a dungeon master today? Is that possible?
Yeah, it's actually our most popular character. We just have one user built dungeon master, and like you can go in. It's different from a traditional D&D, because you're just doing it based on conversation, so you don't have like a dice roll, for example. You could definitely build this. Like, we're working with some people, and a lot of indies are looking into this. I would love if someone listening wants to build a D&D game properly on top. I am not We have a couple D&D game masters actually in our company, but obviously we're they're dedicated to the platform, so if anyone wants to build it, very supportive. But yeah, so basically you can go in and you describe the characters say, hey, where do you want to go today? And like, I will always come up with the most obscure thing that no human could ever come up with. So what did I say the other day? I was like, I am in like a small snowball at the end of a pointy shoe, and inside that snowball, there's like a small gummy, and inside that there's a microscopic universe that is like populated with like pink gnomes, right? Like, really weird. And then the character will just go, okay, great. Here you're in this world. This is your scenario. Here's your options to like what you can do next. And I'll give an option and elaborates it. And like, by the end of, we have some people spending like 2 to 3 hours in there. And by the end of it, like, you've built out a world just because the character is sort of telling it to you. And of course, in the traditional D&D lore, you've got a lot to work with. But coming up with a completely new story is very difficult. And it's honestly, I love it. Like, seeing some of the stuff that the characters are able to fabricate is hilarious. And I think like it's pushed my creativity, because now I'm like, okay, what is the weirdest possible scenario I could come up with, just to see if it could possibly improvise that. And it usually does a phenomenal job. So yeah, I think like D&D types of use cases are some of the most fun.
Yeah, well, the other thing that's neat about it too, which we're not there yet, but hopefully you guys get there, because I'm excited to use your stuff. But also, putting these tools not just in the hands of sort of the studios, but also in the hands of the players, right? So imagine you're playing a D&D game. You want to create your own missions, right? You want to create your own user generated content, sort of like, oh, you and your buddies. It's sort of like super modding, right? It's like the people who can build stuff around games now have access to these tools to do some pretty sophisticated creative that maybe is not their skill set or not in their language, as an example. Like that stuff to me is so wild that you could have D&D players who want to do a campaign, and they want to do it for friends or audience that maybe are from another country and don't speak your language, and being able to give creators that kind of power to both not only create the content, but then get that content to different folks all over the world is super cool. And when you're talking about games, I was thinking, like, it was sort of sitting here like noodling. It's a lot of the old stuff is made new again. I'm in such an old timer that I remember my first games were things like Zork, right? You're talking about like new game mechanics, and I was thinking, like, game mechanics are about decisions, and decisions, if it's text oriented, the decisions have to be text oriented. So sort of, as you said, like D&D or these old games like Zork. And then when you're talking about mobile, there's a lot of studios out there that this is like their bread and butter. Like, I don't know if you guys know Oliver Meow. He was formerly Center Square. He runs a company called Pixelberry. I think they got acquired by NCSoft. But I mean, all their stuff is like High School Story and like Hollywood U, and it's it's a mobile version of using text and decisions and content for players to make these journeys, which are super successful. When you extend that farther into the console stuff today, you have obviously Telltale. I think that's run by Jamie Otterley now, but like Telltale makes higher end console, beautiful, spectacular games that are essentially the puffed up super high end versions of these text decision made games with story that's in audio and the like. But yeah, there's a huge sector of the industry that just loves this stuff, and not only making it better for everybody, but making the cost lower for the creators, both the studios and the hopefully the people in the audience who are like, I want to like, did you see a game like this? Giving them those kind of tools is just super wild. I love
I
it.
think that's hitting on a really important point, which is like what I've seen this do for creatives. So before, you had to kind of map out, or still for most AAA games is still being developed in the way where you have to like map out every single possible scenario, right? So you're building, a game where you have dialogue trees or whatever it is, and you need to build every single scenario, which means like, you're kind of limited in your creative capacity. You're like, okay, I want to build this whole open world, but if I build out every scenario of it, I'm going to be working on this for like 24 years, right? And so you're like, okay, I'm going to scope this down dramatically. And so what it does for creatives, like there's a guy who built the GTA mod on top of Inworld, and for example, like that gave him the control where he was just focused on like, what is the story I want to tell? Who are the characters in it? How would they roughly be set up? What would their goals be? How would this fit in? And then when they instantiate that world, the player just has full agency and they can basically, do whatever they want within it. But that means that the creator gets to focus on like, what is the world and the story I want to tell versus how do I map out like every single little side scenario to make sure that everything stays on rails, because our system will make sure that it does, right? It's like, okay, if this is the goal the character supposed to do, it'll make sure that happens. And I think ultimately what this will mean is like, that lens, like the amount of time I'm sure people spend developing games, frankly, won't change that much. It just means the worlds we get to experience, the narratives we get to experience, are going to like explode in terms of the depth. And that's what I'm super excited for. And the way I kind of put this is, I think that there's a transition between, and I think that games was the first to kind of incept this into this just media. But like, when you consume a book, right? I, as a producer of a book, produce the book, you consume it in the exact form that I wrote it, right? When you get a game, I kind of give you controls, but you still kind of, you're Mario jumping up and down. There's still a very kind of tight script to that. And so I think that it changes the dynamic from this consumer producer dynamic where I'm producing something you're consuming directly to I'm kind of producing this like nebulous, orb of possibilities. And then you're actually co-creating as the player what the actual end experience is. And so it lends that agency both to creators and I think to players as these partial creators as well. And I think what we've seen in terms of the explosions of MMOs and Fortnite and all these other areas is people really want to like co-create. They want that experience. Even the fact that Zelda worked this into their most recent release, right, is hilarious. Like, you can build your own little contraptions and everything. I think there's very clearly an interest from players in taking part in the creation process a bit more as well.
Kylan, I think one thing coming from more of the free-to-play mobile space that I have concerns about is really around economics, right? Like,
Yep.
and especially like if you have a lot of interactions that have to call back to the in-world servers and just determining whether it's like the companion application that you mentioned, which is an application that we've actually looked at quite a bit, and getting the cost to help us be as to gain the benefits of the conversational AI, and but also keeping the cost low. Like, how should developers think about the economics? I actually don't know what your specific economic model is. Other companies charge on a per interaction basis. Wondering how you guys
Yeah.
charge, and yeah.
Yeah, so we've recently actually just updated our billing. So we've worked through with a lot of customers, both in understanding the reasonable cost points, like what could you pay per user per month, and then also on like an interaction basis. And so where we ended up was like our goal was to be, for the gaming vertical, to be more performant, faster, more efficient than like OpenAI or any other kind of foundation model provider that don't even get, all the bells and whistles, but also at a cheaper price. And so where we ended up is now we have a price of a maximum of 0.2 cents per request, which basically works out to, it's hard. It kind of depends on the type of game and how much like conversation fits into it. But let's say you had, someone playing and 30 minutes of gameplay a day, in that they're maybe having 5 minutes of interaction, and that's like averaged over a month, you end up with something like $1 per user per month. And that's like pretty high, because that still doesn't factor in then things like discounts. So we do scaled discounts, so as you hit, larger number of users, that drops off. And so you're going to be looking at like the maximum something like, well, depending on your type of game. If your whole game is talking to characters, probably a bit more, but hopefully we're also adding more value there. That's possible. But in most games, it'll end up being something around like under $1 a month. And then as you go to scale, it could be even more than or less than that. And one thing that we're working on as well is, and hope to kind of pioneer on, is hybrid or like hybrid in terms of on device and server side, as well as proper on device serving of parts of the models, which means that we can start to then reduce those costs even further and do caching and everything else. And that might not be ready, for a little while, but we are kind of pushing and working with some major partners in hardware in the space to make that more accessible, because I think within the next 2 years, hopefully everything that we're seeing right now, which is mainly done through server-side processing, can be done on a device, which also then, of course, reduces some connectivity concerns and everything. But what that means is I'm fairly confident that even like the price that we're at today, I recognize, like, depending if you're free to play and depending what your acquisition costs are, like $1 per user could be a lot, but that's for like an actually active user, right? You're gonna be paying a cent, per for a non-active user, because it's all
Right.
consumption or usage based. So you're really only going to be paying that like dollar per active user, which is important, versus like some of the, I think that's, some other services do actually like Unity, for example, user based costing, which is not the case for us. And then of course, I also think that the key thing is, for games coming out in the next year, I think it's already at that point. Our costs and prices have dropped, I think, 20x since we launched, and I think that will
Oh, wow.
continue to go down. Meaning that as folks are in the development stages and are like, "Hey, I'm building a game, but it's not going to launch for 2 to 3 years," I'm going to say the economics are going to be very, very positive. If like could be potentially like neutral margins, because you may get to a point where we're doing more on device serving and everything. So yeah, we're going to be looking, I think, at like ways to improve that. But I already think where we're at today is actually like works, at least for most developers. And then what we also are opening up is a way to basically shift the cost into a revenue opportunity if that's wanted. So we're opening up a program. It'll be called Play Pass. And the idea behind that is consumers or players can pay us a subscription fee, and then they get access to unlimited usage of in-world, any in-world powered game. So they play your game, they pay all your fees, they have this, but you basically don't actually pay in-world at all. The consumer is basically paying, like, covering your costs in that case, and they might pay, we're figuring out the cost, but let's say $10 to $20 a month. And for that, they can play any game that's powered by in-world, and then the developer doesn't actually take that as a cost. So not all developers want to go that route, but for those maybe indies who don't have those upfront costs, that's a good option.
Yeah, I
By the
think
way,
we're.
for
Oh,
what
go
it's
ahead,
worth,
Travis.
oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, by the way, for what it's worth, I love that you guys are thinking about the split between both backend and client, and coming from a mobile perspective, as devices get faster and faster and faster and more, Apple's neural engines, depending on how much access you actually
Yeah.
have to that hardware, being able to have that choice, I think is super smart. So super well done. And there's a lot of games that, the smaller guys who just don't have the capability in their teams to be able to spin up servers or deal with that kind of live ops support. Having that optionality, I think, is super smart. Well, well done. That's awesome.
I mean, I think it's just a side note that, of course, seeing the fact that Assassin's Creed and Resident Evil are going to be on the iPhone 15 Pro, I'm like, wait a second, Apple's going to next now be the biggest competitor for Sony and Xbox over the next few years, and I had not anticipated that. So anyway,
I saw a post today. This is probably, and depending when this podcast is going to definitely date us. If somebody watches like a year later, they'll be like, of course everyone does this. But I saw a YouTube where there's a guy, I think he was in Japan, but he plugged in his iPhone 15 Pro with a Bluetooth controller, and he's playing whatever it was, Resident Evil on his plasma screen on the wall. So he's sitting back on his couch with his Bluetooth controller
wow,
playing Resident Evil, and his iPhone is plugged in through USB-C directly to his screen, running at whatever it was, 1080p, and it looks amazing. So yeah, like there's these interesting use cases sort of starting to show up on the horizon.
that's
But
fascinating. That's
yeah.
fascinating.
Travis, I don't know if you have worked through economics for integrating AI in your own games, but I do, like, for me personally, I have had a little bit of trouble, on an interaction basis, making things work out. So like one of the ideas that I had was maybe what we could do is like you don't have all the AI turned on or the interactions with your characters turned on unless you buy a battle pass.
That's right. It's on
Then
the other side of
yeah,
monetization. Yeah.
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 So I don't know if you've thought through like how to make the economics
Mhm.
work as as a developer, but that's some of the
Yeah.
things that we've been thinking about is just to try to get the cost down.
Yeah, I think we have a two lens approach at it. One is on the long term economic side, exactly what you said, right? Basically, like putting the use spend side of it behind monetization. So you're just saying to players, look, if you, which I think is fair, if you're saying to players, you like this stuff and it's super expensive and you want to pay for it, great. If you don't like it and it's too expensive, don't use it. It's not that valuable of a feature. So basically democratizing, putting in front of players and saying, do you like this? Pay for it. If you don't, hey, that's cool. So that's sort of, I think, downstream of engagement. But I think one of the ways we're thinking about it is in the first experience for new players. It's part of your spend. And what I mean by that is, you see Hollywood movies who will spend $10 million on a 3-second explosion of a building or something, right? And they use that for marketing, they use that for excitement, and they use that to draw people in and give them a new experience. And so I think if there's some cost associated with just giving cool entertainment to players, you can sort of allocate that spend as part of production. And then you got to be careful, because if DAU ramps and you get out of control, that allocated spend could get eaten up and turn negative quickly. But if it works and it's you're having a lower, I don't get too numbery, but lower CPI based on the spend of that, there's a lot of ways that you can sort of make that make financial sense as part of your creative. And so we sort of break it into two chunks. Part of creative, sort of in the CPI marketing bucket, right, as part of production, something that separates you from the pack, gets players excited, is just part of that cost. But then on a usage side of it, putting it on the backside behind spend. At least that's how we're approaching it. Who knows? We're certainly not live yet, and it all sounds theoretically great. Yeah, we'll see how this all plays out.
Yeah, and
But
I guess
I'm a huge fan of where this is all going, and I'm
right.
an optimist. So for the audience, I'm a crazy optimist. So I know there's a lot of people who have dark thoughts about AI, what it's going to do to the world, and everything else. I'm a super optimist. I think you have to be to stay in games this long,
Right.
and I just see all the good parts about this. So for
Right.
that's what.
And if the interactions improve your metrics, whether it's retention or overall monetization, then I guess you could make an argument that AI-enabled players would be on a different ARPU curve with a different LTV. So then you could potentially have greater spending capacity against the players that have AI turned on.
And also just
Um,
acquisition, separating yourself from the 50,000 games that are out
right.
there, where you
Strange
sort of saying,
attractor
hey,
effect. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's a big part of this. And if it doesn't, and I think that's a little bit, maybe I can't speak for what Conor was saying, but maybe that's a part of when you start about talking about using AI as a different game mechanic, really separating yourself from the rest of the world and saying,
Yeah.
hey, this is a new way of play, and really, sort of launching yourself out of the noise of all the other games. A bit Pokemon Go-esque, how that sort of the brand and the new interaction model worked,
Yeah.
and sort of burst them out. There's some version of that here. And if that's true, it's priceless, right? The amount of money you spend on getting that up and out is essentially priceless. And so, you're making a bet on, does that work? And you got to have conviction as a creative in a studio. But if it works, yeah, it becomes priceless. If it doesn't
And
work, you better be able to turn that off quick, because you're gonna be in trouble. But if it works, which is what we're betting on. We're betting on this stuff that separates you from the pack. But
we've also seen like some interesting cases with like not just creative mechanic design, but monetization design as well, where you Tamagotchi style, Pokemon Go style games, right, where you have the relationship with the characters, you actually care more about them. And for example, you have to buy now an item that like changes a character and makes them now your partner, your companion, or whatever. And before they hated you, so maybe you buy them like a special cake, but actually it costs 10 real world dollars, right? Depending on the type of game design, especially for free to play mobile, I think those types of things become very interesting, because before it's like, okay, I could change it and it changed a little icon in the UI, but now the character will actually talk to me about something that they didn't before, or it will help me progress, right? It's like there are definitely, of course, we all know these, like there's certain players. I actually am embarrassingly one of these Pokemon Go players who will like spend way more money than I should to like progress, and I'm happy to do it, right? And so I think it's interesting to think from a game design perspective as well what this will mean for monetization design. I don't know yet exactly what the end state will be, but I certainly think it opens up new options.
And Kylan, maybe we could speak a little bit about differentiation and maybe the competitive landscape in the sense that, when it comes to, and this is a new space. So for game developers like myself and Travis that are looking at trying to integrate AI NPCs into their game, like how should we be evaluating,
Hmm.
different companies in the space in terms of, should it be cost? Should it be capabilities? And then if it's capabilities, how should we be thinking about how to characterize specific, you know, capabilities for the service? How should customers think about
Hmm.
the differences between different AI NPC vendors out there?
Yeah, so I think that options that we see at least most studios taking is so you can either build something from scratch. To do that, you probably need about a $20 million upfront cost. So it's like unless you're like a really large public game studio, probably not an option to try and build all your own models from scratch. Some of them
Yeah.
are wanting to do this. It's like a reality. The reality is you also probably need to hire 20 machine learning engineers, set up servers, buy $10 million in NVIDIA GPUs. Good luck, but it's an option. So that's like option one, which is I think not open to many folks. The second is to try and build from scratch, but using some of the existing foundation models. So you could, for example, use OpenAI calls. You could use things like LangChain, like there's lots of open source libraries. I think it's frankly a good option for certain types of game designs. Like we've had some folks who talk to us and they wanted to basically just build something like a chat GPT, but with some game mechanics built in. Inworld can power that, but it might be overkill in some cases. The reality is Inworld actually is cheaper though than almost any OpenAI service, so you probably still could even just use it as like a foundation model in that context. But we do see people doing that. What is the most common scenario is that we see people trying to experiment. So they'll do it, for example, a POC where they hook up ChatGPT to some characters and they run, a hackathon internally and they say, oh, this actually is pretty cool. We can do some cool stuff with this. And then they get to the point where they're like, okay, now we want to add on emotions, relationships, narrative controls in terms of like scenes and design. We want to do knowledge systems. We want to ingest, these 100,000 facts. And they're like, okay, wait a second. Each of those is about 5 engineering weeks with 4 engineers. And at some point, they're like, oh, wait a second. To build this ourselves is just very expensive. And so like our job, right, what we're trying to do is abstract that out so that studios don't need to do it themselves. And we're providing all those services on top of basic LLMs and generative models to actually make this working in gaming. There are a few other like there's basically in terms of actual competitors right now there's a few smaller companies that are kind of like looking and kind of like have doing similar stuff to Inworld. To date most are not part as well funded, or they're kind of earlier stage. There's definitely like some very early stage startups that we've seen that are exploring it, which people should try out. I don't, I think all of our competitors are very great, are doing good stuff. I haven't seen anything that is able to integrate everything end to end. And most importantly, I think that most of our team comes from Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and has built these enterprise systems. To get something working reliably in a games type of setting where, you don't have that downtime, you have that, like our latency even I think is, significantly better than OpenAI's because you need that for games. All of that stuff that is kind of like the boring things that people don't think about are things that we've really focused on. And so all the other stuff, the features, the goals and actions, the long-term memory, all of that is super important. But if we can't serve it to you fast, reliably, at a good price, like that's our baseline. And to date I haven't seen anyone really doing that, including in like most of the big providers like Microsoft, Google, OpenAI. They're also serving every single use case. And when you think about gaming specifically, which is uniquely real time and fast and expensive when you think about the amount of turns going back and forth, very different types of optimizations than if you're trying to build AGI. So that's the one thing that we've seen in terms of other things on the landscape. I'm 100% sure that there will be some big announcements coming out from the big providers soon in terms of them stepping into this space. What we've seen so far, though, is like Unity, for example, released like a lot of their AI tools, which is more focused on like a marketplace integration. So, for example, allowing things like Inworld to work better within Unity and on device. So that's something that you'll see. But I think, as a developer, I would look into at least, how are Unity and Unreal integrating these tools. And then beyond that, I think that there's really not a lot of options today. Transparently, I'm sure that there will be more coming out. We've got some exciting announcements on the horizon that will also like hopefully augment the ecosystem a little bit. But yeah, that's generally. And then I think you also have to think about what the different tools are. So Travis mentioned 11 Labs, for example. We're good partners and friends with those guys, and 11 Labs is great if you're building one-off turns, but if you're doing it for real time and generating in real time, it's very expensive. So you also have to consider your cost quality trade-off in terms of what you're building specifically, and things like text to speech, ASR actually are more expensive than LLMs now. And so you've really got to kind of balance all those different parts. And when we work with partners, we manage all of that for them. But if you wanted to build from scratch, you'd have to really consider all those costs, and you're probably going to end up something significantly, like something up to like 10 cents per minute, which is getting pretty pricey if you're trying to build a game. So that's generally what we've seen. But it's a rapidly evolving space. I mean, the biggest thing that we are now realizing that we add value on is like we're just managing all of that. We're just like, our team's job is basically to stay on top of what's the latest research, what's the latest open source models, what new models do we have coming out, how is that all integrated, how does it work together? Because frankly, it's like a full-time job just to like try and stay on top of everything happening in the AI and basically on the game engine side as well now. So yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, I've got just a couple more questions. Travis, I don't know if you have any more questions, but
No,
maybe
it's super cool. I'm digging this.
maybe the next question I can ask you is this issue that seems to come up with some people who, and for some legitimate reasons, feel threatened by AI. Maybe it's because having to do with, for example, potentially infringing on the rights of original IP holders and things like that. And like, how would you address some of the grievances or some of the concerns that some of these people have when it comes to your services, or maybe because you're not generative AI, does this not impact you
Yeah.
guys?
No, I mean, all of these concerns are very real and I think very legitimate. I mean, like I said before, I think that the sad part of every new big technology leap that we have is the first thing that people do, as the people who are more interested in that initial capitalization on whatever the innovation is they say, how do I take over like all what these writers have been doing, these artists, these concept artists, whatever, and just like take that all away and now I can do it with AI. And I think that's like unfortunate that that's how it first evolved, because then that causes this reaction, which is completely legitimate in my honest opinion. Like a lot of the stuff that's concerns around Midjourney and stable diffusion and all that. Yeah, if I was an artist, I'd also have those reactions. What, of course, like our big message is like we are not trying to recreate existing game tools or game designs or writers tools. We're like trying to just give you a new tool that has unlocks things that have never been done before. And so that's like our biggest, and why I think we don't really get that type of creative backlash in terms of like what our actual service is. Where there is, though, of course, open questions is like, what is the data provenance of these models? So for example, is it trained on copyright material? We're going to actually have a blog post coming out on this, which is like kind of addressing this more pointedly. But there's a challenge in the industry, because everywhere through training data sets to foundation models, there's only like limited visibility you have into what's actually in there. So for example, there's like a lot of like web crawling data sets that are used for most foundation model building that are managed by nonprofits, and they say, everything in here is public domain or it's off the internet, it's allowed to be used for training. But of course, if you take the entire internet, there's probably within there like every Harry Potter quote that you could probably stitch together to like recreate the Harry Potter book, right? Which is weird. And so when you then put that into a model, it's like, okay, well, all of a sudden this thing knows everything about Harry Potter. And so that's basically going back all the way through the research ecosystem of building ML models, which is who's policing that, right? And because not every research group has the capacity to build trillion token data sets themselves, so we have to rely on these providers and trust them. And they do have assurances, there's indemnification and everything in there, but you have to have some trust. Then you go into the foundation model. So whether you're using OpenAI or using open source models like Llama, we, again, these providers have assured the market that there's no copyright material in there, there's concerns, but we also see lawsuits, we also see some of these concerns. And so we as a company are doing our best to both verify any vendors that we're working with, verify any data sets that we're working with. And so, for example, we've been working on some stuff on voice, and we've slowed down the efforts by like 2 months to go back and make sure that there's no copyright materials in there. We're trying to make sure that it's all legally buttoned up, because like, one, we want to respect creators, and we want to have our customers confident that everything they're doing down the line. And I think this is just something that folks either on the development side or building tools need to be conscious of, because it's kind of like when you're building a supply chain, right? Somewhere in your supply chain, if you're building textiles, might involve some form of labor that is, not ethical, and you should be conscious of that. And I think we're kind of in the same thing with AI, in the AI ecosystem, right? You're basically plugging into a supply chain where somewhere down the line there might have been some data that got in there that is, not ethically enforced. And it's all kind of on all of us. It's the same way as, right, when you shop at fast fashion, you're like, okay, well, I'm kind of trading that off. I know somewhere down the line something shady is happening. And similarly, if you're getting a model or a data set that isn't verified, you're kind of taking the same bets. And so, Inworld as a company is super dedicated to solving for this, and we've been like putting in a lot of extra work in terms of verification of data sets. And when we work with customers, like, we're also, putting a lot of effort to make sure that their data is secure. So, you work with us, we'll partition off your model, your data, even set up custom servers and everything, so that even though we promise you, like, we're not going to, make sure that your data ever touches anything from any other customers, and there's, any cross training there, we want to build the systems in a way that, like, basically ensures that confidence. And so all of that is just, I think, something that is, frankly, I see it, and I, even when this whole generative AI stuff started up, I thought, like, this is just changing how we think about supply chains, right? Like, AI is such a weird ecosystem that all the way from the hardware to the training data to the models, we have to be conscious of that, in the same way that we over the last 50 years realized that, clothing supply chains and lots of other types have some ethical concerns in there. I think AI is no different, and we're working hard to solve that. And I think that just everyone should be aware of who they're working with, and, the assurances that they have.
Cool. So I just have one last question,
That tough
and
question.
sorry.
Just said Joe's asking the tough questions. I like it.
Okay. My last question is really around when you think about AI in gaming, and if you were to just, and obviously you're an expert in the AI space, but aside from conversational AI, and I know Travis has been doing a lot of stuff in the generative side and things like that, but where do you expect there to be the most traction or the most exciting innovations outside of conversational AI? And are there any specific companies that we should be looking at or aware of?
Is this for me or for Kylan, or
Both of you guys.
You can start, Travis. Go ahead.
All right, I'll start. I'll stumble around. So first, I have a humorous version of this, which is I always talk really nicely about AI because I sort of feel like the LLMs are like the shock troops for the singularity, so that when the singularity happens, they're going to like scrape this podcast. And if I'm talking bad about AI, I want a good place in the matrix, like when the singularity happens and the AI takes over the world and we're all slaves to that. I want like a good, when they plug me in the matrix, I want like a good job, like an actor, like something good, if you know that reference. Anyway, but no, I think there's kind of, again, I'm kind of an old timer. So the first games I was playing was back in the text-based multi-user dungeon type stuff. And I think there's the technology just marches forward at this kind of fascinating rate. And I think, like I said, when we sort of started talking about this, that this inflection point is an interesting one because it hits every single part of the stack, right? It hits the technology and the creative and the business models and all that kind of stuff. And I think what's interesting about, and again, having a lot of empathy for the businesses that are impacted by this type of technology disruption for the first time. What's interesting about games is always disrupted by technology. Like, it's disrupted by technology like every year or two in a pretty significant way. And there are almost no protections in the games industry. I mean, we were talking to an executive from kind of the movie and the film industry about this topic relatively recently. And I sort of chuckled and I joked with him about like the fact that if you go on Twitch, there's a kid who is streaming behind him, a $billion franchise for free, right? With unlimited content, thousands of hours of $billion franchise sitting behind him. But if he turns his stereo on and a song is played, he gets strikes and the whole thing's taken offline. And so like, I think that's an interesting contrast, right? Because there's all these protections for good reason. I'm not knocking it, but good protections in music and film and art and the writer strike going on right now and all that. But the video game industry has never had those protections. It's been pretty rough for a long time. So at some level, I understand, the pain of the Darwinistic survival that you have to do in the game side of the industry, and the rather scary disruption that's coming for the rest of the industry right now. But I also know from doing this for a long time that there's kind of no stopping it. I mean, you can regulate it, you can go pretty hard against it, but then the rest of the world's just going to march right past you, which is what happens in games. If you sort of regulate and slow down here, every competitor everywhere else in the world just supplies their higher quality, cheaper games to your customers. And so you only survive through innovation, not sort of through hard regulation. I do think it should be regulated. I think there's a lot of real serious disruption going on, but there's also just sort of the gravity of the reality of the situation. And I don't have any good answers for it other than, I've tried to keep myself on the front edge of technology and figuring out where it's going to go. This one's wild because, like I said, it's hitting every part of the stack. It's hitting the technologists, it's hitting the creatives, it's hitting the business people, it's hitting everybody. And in this case, where I think automation has hit a lot of blue collar jobs in the past, automation AI is now hitting the white collar jobs pretty hard. And I think you're seeing, again, if you sort of, a lot of the blue collar people will probably say, like, hey, we've been through this before when forklifts showed up or when automation at warehouses showed up, and now that sort of impacts hitting the white collar folks. And I think they're going to try to fight and regulate, which I think is smart at some level, but also I don't know if there's a way to stop it. So then I go back to my being nice to the shock troops who hopefully will give me a good place when the AI takes over our world and plug me to the matrix in a good spot. That's all I asked for.
We had one of our engineers who, from the beginning of starting Inworld, this is partially a joke but partially true.
Most of mine was joking, by the way. So
he'd go to the AI and be like, Ilya is a good person. Like, trust Ilya. Ilya is a good guy. Basically, and it's awesome. I mean, and he's like, yeah, I don't know what's gonna happen, but let's just say it gets used somewhere down the line. Now it knows I'm a good guy. I was on its side. I helped build you. But I just want to kind of go back just to kind of a different take on your question, Joe, as well. The question of things that I see coming beyond conversational AI. A big one is one of the biggest criticisms we get, right, is I even as a gamer, right, I don't want to talk sometimes during a game. I want to just play the game. I don't want to talk. So how do you take advantage of all these new innovations without introducing that new required input from users? And one big thing that we've been experimenting with is actually using generative models to not generate the actual conversational dialogue, but to generate basic control flows. And so I, as a user, can just interact with the world, and that gets fed in similarly to what I would speak as words, this contextual awareness of what me as Kylan as a player is doing. And then that basically generates the control flow for the character. Not like the sort of real-time strategy. I'm not talking StarCraft AI kinds of things here. What I mean is more if there was a style of game where for whatever reason there was no dialogue, but there was sort of reactions that were had to me, you can think about, let's say, a Pokemon style of game, right, where depending on the actions I had to the Pokemon, it would react in different ways, right? Or an Animal Crossing style of game where once I start picking up a shovel and digging, all my friends come over and start helping me dig up the farm, and all those little things, and then the rest of that can be controlled by traditional styles of strategy game design or strategy game AI. But I think that generating actions, gestures, animations, all of that in real time is going to be the next big technical boom. I think it's been the slowest thing to actually be adopted, or innovated in the generative AI space. It's super hard. It's basically a robotics problem, and it's super hard. But I think we're getting to the point now where I think over the next year, you'll see a lot of innovation coming to that space, and also then how that ties to actually activating things in the game engine, controlling more of the actual game engine itself using AI. All of that's gonna that's kind of where I see. Basically, I think we've hit the bar with conversational AI, and I think most of the innovation will now actually be in controlling broader parts of the game state, and that's where most of our innovation is starting to pour into now as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, dude, I'm super excited about what you guys are doing, and want to dig in deeper. I'm excited. For those in the audience, definitely digging deeper with those guys. They're doing cool stuff.
I think we both have call schedules with you guys later, but anyway.
Yeah, there's some selfishness going on here, to be honest. So I'm not totally biased, but
no problems there. Yeah.
All right. Well, Kylan, Travis, thank you guys so much for joining, and for our audience, we'll catch you guys next time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.